So a couple weeks ago, I was hanging a TV on a wall, and we bought a little kit from Walmart on, it's supposed to hook up to the back of your TV. And I've done this before with different type of setup, and this one it was a different type of, different type of device. I wasn't familiar with it, so I opened it, looked at it, and thought, okay, I know how it goes. And so I started putting it together. And then went to go put it on the back of the TV and realized, oh no, I put these things on the wrong side. So I took it apart and put it on the right side, and then put it back in and went, oh wait a minute, there's 4 of them, and I actually reversed some of them because they have to go differently, and I was getting more and more frustrated. And so finally I decided to look at the manual, which is really just the manufacturer's opinion. But it is amazing how often it is helpful, and how rarely I actually start by looking at the manual. Whenever I am putting together anything, I almost always look at it first and try and figure it out and see if I can do it. And if I get stuck, then I figure, well, maybe I'll see what the manufacturer thinks I should do. But it's amazing how rarely I start there, even if I always finish there. Another story, and it's all going to come together. I've been reading the Chronicles of Narnia with the kids. I did it with Asher a few years ago, and I've done it with Abby, and now more recently with Annalise. Anna and I just finished. We just finished The Silver Chair, and if you've never read The Silver Chair, I highly recommend all these books. I mean, they're just really creative. C.S. Lewis had he was a brilliant man, but he also had an amazing creative mind when it came to this fantasy series. And so the story of The Silver Chair is the king. I guess the prince of Narnia has been captured, and 2 people have been brought into this world of Narnia to save him. And because they get a message from Aslan, or Aslan tells them, you have to do these certain things in this order. You must remember these signs. These are the signs I'm giving you. I want you to follow them and do them to the letter. And if you do that, it's going to be a whole lot easier for you. But right away, they forget the signs. The first thing they do, for various reasons, they don't do the first step, and then they mess that up, and then they mess up the second step, and then they mess up the third step. The reason they mess it up is because the girl whose job it is to remember them stops repeating them. She stops going over and over and over in her head, so she forgets what they are, and she gets them kind of mixed up. And throughout the book, there's this idea that you're supposed to remember the signs, and yet they're not remembering the signs, and so their journey becomes a lot more difficult than it needs to be. And so if you want to look at it this way, the manufacturer's opinion is sort of like the signs, and if you were to follow the signs, the job would be a whole lot easier. The problem is, we often think we know better. We don't want to hear what other people have to say. We don't want to hear what professionals have to say, and you certainly see this all the time on social media. There are people who should know better and tell us, and we say, I'll do my own thing. We go our own way. The worst part about this is that we do it when it comes to God. I mean, God has some people have referred to the Bible as an instruction manual for life. It is that. I mean, it's so much more. I mean, it's the book that tells us all about Jesus, which means it's more than just how to get through your day-to-day life. But that's included in there. I mean, God has written to us, this is the way you should live your life. And how often do we ignore it? How often do we only come to it after we've already messed up and have to I don't know what I'm doing, so now I'll come and I'll read the manufacturer's opinion. If you ignore God when He tells you to do something, the result will always be inferior to His original plan. If you ignore God when He tells you to do something, the result will always be inferior to His original plan. Now, disclaimer, it doesn't mean that if you always obey God, your life is going to be all super easy and no problems. Okay, that's not the way it works either. But it is definitely true that if you follow God's plan for your life, then your life is going to end up easier than it would otherwise. If you don't follow Him, it's always going to be inferior. So going back to the silver chair, they forgot the rules, they forgot the things that Aslan, which represents Jesus, told them to do, and so they were able to get through it, but it was more difficult. Each step was more and more difficult than it had to be because they forgot the rules, they forgot the signs. There's an author named Tim Keller, and he wrote, "If we knew what God knows, we would ask exactly for what He gives." I'll say that again. If we knew what God knows, we would ask exactly for what he gives. So even if you don't understand the signs, even if you don't understand the rules, even if you think, I don't like what this book has to say sometimes, if we knew what God knows, we would ask for exactly what he tells us to do. We're starting a series this morning, a new series called Rotten Rescuers. When I was a kid, I would get bored in church. And so I would read, I know that never happens now, but I would read parts of the Old Testament. And parts of the Old Testament, maybe partly because my last name is Knight, I was always drawn to sort of medieval history and knights in shining armor and stuff like that. There are parts of the Old Testament that kind of remind me of that. I mean, it's all about battles and warfare, and I've talked about this before. The book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, the life of David, those were some of my favorites. Judges was also one of my favorites that I would go to. And someone asked me one time when I was a kid, who's your favorite Bible character? And probably expecting the answer to be Jesus. And at the time I said, I have 3. And it's Samson, David, and Solomon. And they were kind of surprised by that. And I said, well, David was like a hero. He was like the ultimate hero when it comes to warfare and that kind of thing. Solomon was the smartest man that ever lived, or the wisest man that ever lived. And Samson, was the strongest man in the Bible. So as a teenage boy, I'm thinking, what more do you want? That's like the whole package. The more I got to understand what was going on here, I realized Samson was not somebody to look up to. He was strong, and that was about it. And he was very weak in some ways. Solomon, may have been wise, but he didn't always use the wisdom that he was given. So I narrowed it down to just David. So now David's my favorite. The reason I mention all that is because Samson is one of the judges that we're going to be looking at. This series, Rotten Rescuers, is about the book of Judges. And they are the judges were people. They're not like you're maybe thinking where it's like a magistrate, where someone you come to and they solve your legal problems. The judge was more like a heroic rescuer. Something along the lines of like a David, someone that God would raise up that would save the people from everything that was going on. The reason that I'm calling them the rotten rescuers is because increasingly they become worse and worse. I mean, the situation in Israel becomes worse and worse, and the rescuers become worse and worse. And so God empowers them, and they do rescue Israel, but they're not great people. And the situation that they save them from is only temporal. And so we're going to look at this maybe less than inspiring book. It's not less than inspiring. It's the book is really tragic what it teaches us about men, about mankind. Really tragic, because you just see the mistakes that people make. But it's inspiring when it teaches us about God and his patience with his people, and his willingness to come to the rescue again and again and again, even though they turn their back on him again and again and again. So this morning we're starting with the first judge, but you need a little bit of backstory. And so for quick history lesson, God has his chosen people. They become slaves in Egypt, and then God rescues them out of that. That's the Exodus. And Moses is the leader there. And then they spend some time in the wilderness. They could have gone right into the promised land because they didn't have faith in God. They spend some time in the wilderness. And God uses the next 40 years basically he got them out of Egypt, but now he's getting Egypt out of them as much as possible. And so the book of Joshua is them crossing into the promised land and doing most of the conquering. I mean, the military back of the Canaanites was broken at this point. And Judges should have been the story of them coming in and taking over the land in victory. But that's not what we see. I'm going to start with Judges chapter 1, verse 30. This section of Judges, it's subtitled in my Bible, The Failure of Israel. Failure of Israel to conquer the land. And so starting in verse 30, I mean, there's stuff that comes before this, but this sort of brings it home for me. The tribe of Zebulun, and this is talking about the number of tribes that are in Israel. The tribe of Zebulun failed to drive out the residents of Kitron and Nahalol. So the Canaanites continued to live among them, but the Canaanites were forced to work as slaves for the people of Zebulun. Okay, key words here. Tribe of Zebulun failed to drive out the residents, so the Canaanites continued to live among them. Verse 31, the tribe of Asher failed to drive out the residents of Akko, Sidon, Alab, Akseb, and Helba, Aphik, and Rehob. Instead, the people of Asher moved in among the Canaanites who controlled the land, for they failed to drive them out. You guys see the difference there? So the first tribe, they failed to drive them out, so they've already failed in some ways. But then it says the Canaanites continued to live among them. Asher, it says they moved in among the Canaanites. Same thing with Naphtali. Likewise, the tribe of Naphtali failed to drive out the residents of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath. Instead, they moved in among the Canaanites who controlled the land. Nevertheless, the people of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were forced to work as slaves for the people of Naphtali. So there's a lot of names of cities and towns and stuff going on there. And I think I did a pretty good job. But understand what's happening. The tribes are coming in, and some of them, it says they conquered the people, and we'll come to this in a second, and they drove them out. But here it says they didn't drive them out. Zebulun, it says the Canaanites continued to live among the Israelites, which meant, in the wording there, it means the Israelites have the upper hand. All right? Asher and Naphtali, they moved in, and they live among the Canaanites. Not only did they not drive them out, which they were told to do, they're actually subservient in a lot of ways to the Canaanites. It's still Canaanite land. They're just living there. Now, Naphtali, it says that the people of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were forced to work as slaves for the people of Naphtali. So on one hand, you think, well, they're better off than Asher because at least they conquered the people and they're using them as slave labor. But it's important to know what those words mean, Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath. Whenever you see the word Beth in the Bible, it means house. All right? Beth Lehem means house of bread. Beth Shemeth was a Canaanite goddess of the sun. So these Israelites are coming in, they're supposed to conquer the people, drive them out. They don't do it. They move in among them. And even if they are, in a sense, over them because the other people are slaves, they're still living in the Canaanite goddess of the sun town. Beth Anath was the goddess of fertility, hunting, and war. So they are living in a town that is named in the honor of foreign gods. When God said, I want you to conquer the land, I want you to be my people, not chase after foreign gods, these people were supposed to do that. They failed. Okay, I'm going to jump back to Judges chapter 1, verse 22. This is in that same section talking about where they failed to conquer the land properly. This might be the best story of the bunch. It says, the descendants of Joseph attacked the town of Bethel, and the Lord was with them. They sent men to scout out Bethel, formerly known as Luz. So when they attack the town, it's known as Luz. Later on, when this was written, it's known as Bethel. And the Lord was with them. So they confronted a man coming out of the town and said to him, show us a way into the town, and we will have mercy on you. So he showed them a way in, and they killed everyone in town except the man and his family. Later that man moved to the land of the Hittites, where he built a town. He named it Luz, which is its name to this day. So, as horrible as all these things sound, going in and conquering and killing everybody, we have to understand we can't judge ancient history by modern day standards. It was a different time, different place. Holy war is a whole different topic, which we're not getting into today. All we need to know is that God commanded them to do something, and this is probably the closest version of them doing it. And the result is the town is no longer called Luz, which was probably meant to honor the goddess of Asherah. The town is now called Bethel, which means house of God. And so this was what was supposed to happen. The people were supposed to come in, take over, and their towns would be in honor of Yahweh, of God of the Israel. Instead, they live in towns that are honoring other gods. And this comes back to bite them. We're going to move to chapter 2, Judges chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said to the Israelites, I brought you out of Egypt into this land, and I swore to give your ancestors, and I said I would never break my covenant with you. For your part, you were not to make any covenants with the people living in this land. Instead, you were to destroy their altars. But you disobeyed my command. Why did you do this? So now I declare I will no longer drive out the people living in your land. They will be thorns in your side, and their gods will be a constant temptation to you. And so God's basically saying to them, I was going to do all the hard work. And you see this in some of the stories, where they go in. I think in one story, God sends hornets to drive the people out of the land ahead of them. So the Israelites don't even have to do much. And this was supposed to be the way. It wasn't supposed to be easy for them, but definitely easier. When you fail to obey the things God has told you to do, then your life is going to be less than ideal. And so now God's saying, I'm not going to do it now. I'm not going to drive them out. I'm not going to do it. And the result is going to be temptation for you. Basically, you're saying, you don't want me to be your God. You don't want to follow what I have to do, what I'm telling you to do. And so the result is you're going to get what you've asked for. Now, God told them in advance that this was probably going to happen. He says, if you do not drive out the inhabitants, Numbers chapter 33, verse 55. If you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be as irritants in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. He gave them the warning. They didn't listen to it, and now the result is that they have to live with these people as a thorn in their side and their gods as temptations. So let's look at verse 10 of chapter 2. It says, after that generation died, talking about the generation that came in to conquer the land. After that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things that he had done for Israel. I want to take us back to Deuteronomy chapter 11, starting in verse 13. This is when they're in the wilderness, just getting ready to move into the promised land. And God is sort of renewing his covenant with them, or helping them to remember, this is what our deal is, okay? I'm going to move you to the promised land. I'm going to be your God. And he says, if you carefully obey all the commands I'm giving you today, and if you love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and soul, then he will send the rains in their proper seasons, and the early and late rains, so you can bring in your harvest of grain, new wine, and olive oil. He will give you lush pasture land for your livestock, and you yourselves will have all you want to eat. Follow the manufacturer's opinion, and things are going to go well for you. All right, it's going to be an easier life for you if you do what God says to do. But be careful. Don't let your heart be deceived so that you turn away from the Lord and serve and worship other gods. If you do, the Lord's anger will burn against you. He will shut up the sky and hold back the rain and ground, and the ground will fail to produce its harvest. Then you will quickly die in that good land the Lord has given you. In other words, if you're saying that you don't want me to be involved, then I won't be involved, and the result is going to be bad things are going to happen. So commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these words of mine. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Teach them to your children. Talk about them when you're at home, when you're on the road, when you're going to bed, and when you're getting up. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, so that as long as the sky remains above the earth, you and your children may flourish in the land the Lord swore to give your ancestors. Be careful to obey all these commands I'm giving you. Show love to the Lord your God by walking in his ways and holding tightly to him. Then the Lord will drive out all the nations ahead of you, though they are much greater and stronger than you, and you will take over their land. Wherever you set foot, that land will be yours. Your frontiers will stretch from the wilderness in the south to Lebanon in the north, and from the Euphrates River in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you, for the Lord your God will cause the people to fear and dread you, as he promised, wherever you go in the whole land. Teach your children these things, so that it'll go well with you and it'll go well with them. Now, I've said this before. I really don't have a whole lot of patience when I hear people say, it's fine for us to have faith, but I don't want to impress that on my children. I don't want to force my faith on my children. I want to let them decide for themselves. And whenever I talk about this, I usually say, you generally don't let your children decide what they eat for themselves. You generally don't let them decide when their bedtime is. You don't generally let them decide whether or not they go to school. In fact, this is probably the only place where people say, I'm going to let my child decide this very important thing for themselves. The irony is that this is the most important thing. And so you're not forcing this on your children, you're helping them to understand that this is what God has for them. So it is our job as parents to impress our faith on our children, to share our faith with our children, to lead them in the way they should go. Israel fails to do that. God warned them. He told them, this is what you need to do. And they didn't do it. After that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. We sang a song earlier. It said, I raised my Ebenezer. And every time I see it, I think, I bet you no one has any idea what an Ebenezer is, because I don't have any idea what an Ebenezer is. I've learned now. An Ebenezer was a stone that they put up. Samuel would put up this stone and say, this is an Ebenezer. This is to show future generations the great things that God has done for us. But when they fail to do that, then the children don't understand it. They don't care about it. And then when the parents die, the next generation has nothing to do with God. So verse 11, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. That's one of the gods of Canaan. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them, and they angered the Lord. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Ashtoreth, or sometimes called Asherah. This made the Lord burn with anger against Israel, so he handed them over to the raiders who stole their possessions. He turned them over to their enemies all around. They were no longer able to resist them. Every time Israel went out to battle, the Lord fought against them, causing them to be defeated, just as he had warned, and the people were in great distress. The Israelites at this time lived in an agrarian society. And so when you look at the god of Baal, which they believed was the one who would cause the rain to come and the sun to shine and all those things, you realize that really this is the god of money. They're worshiping the god of money when they worship Baal. Asherah was the god of fertility. And so they're really worshiping sex when it comes to the god of Asherah. So what you see is the Israelites walking away from the one true God to chase after money and sex. Aren't you glad we've come so far? That we don't do those things today. Verse 16. This explains the book of Judges. It says, Then the Lord raised up judges to rescue the Israelites from their attackers. Yet Israel did not listen to the judges, but prostituted themselves by worshiping other gods. How quickly they turned away from the path of their ancestors, who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge over Israel, he was with the judge, and rescued the people from their enemies throughout the judge's lifetime. For the Lord took pity on his people, who were burdened by oppression and suffering. So again, this teaches us more about God and his patience with people than it does about... It teaches us bad things about mankind, good things about God. But when the judge died, the people returned to their corrupt ways, behaving worse than those who had lived before them. They went after other gods, serving and worshiping them, and they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. And so this is what's called the cycle of apostasy. Israel has a relationship with God. They turn their back on God. They chase after other gods. They get the natural result of turning their back on God, and things go bad for them. They come under some kind of distress, usually in the form of some of these people who they were supposed to drive out. They come under their thumb. They call out for help from God. They finally go back to the manufacturer's opinion and say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to ask help from God. God would raise up a judge, not because the judge was amazing, but because God empowered him to do it, because God loved his people. That judge would rescue the people, and then there'd be peace in the lifetime of the judge. That judge would die, and then the cycle would repeat over and over and over again. And it's more like a drain, because it would slowly but surely get worse. With each cycle, the situation gets worse, and the people get worse. So we'll go to chapter 3, verse 5. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and they intermarried with them. Israelite sons married their daughters, and Israelite daughters were given in marriage to their sons. Now, this is not an issue of race. Okay, this isn't a problem with marrying someone of a different race. This is an issue of faith and religion. The last part of this verse says, and the Israelites served their gods. So what was happening is they would intermarry with someone with a different faith background, and what would happen is the Israelites would turn and start worshiping Baal and Asherah and all the other foreign gods. And then we get to our first judge, our first hero. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot about the Lord their God, and they served the images of Baal and the Asherah poles. Then the Lord burned with anger against Israel. He turned them over to King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram-Naharaim, and the Israelites served Cushan-Rishathaim for 8 years. Cushan-Rishathaim, the name actually, basically, a simple translation for today would be Batty McBadface. All right, is basically he's twice evil bad guy. All right, that's his name. So you can tell this is probably written after the fact, and that's probably his nickname. But they're under his thumb for 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, right, the cycle of apostasy, the Lord raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Othniel, which, by the way, if anyone's pregnant and looking for a name for their child, Othniel would be a great choice. Now, Othniel, we first see his name back in Judges chapter 1, verse 12. Caleb, who was one of the heroes of Israel during this time, he was one of the guys, like Joshua, who decided we actually should go into the land and take it. But because they didn't listen to Caleb, they spent 40 years in the desert. Now, Caleb's an old man at this point, and he's come in, and he's tough, right? He's an old, tough guy, and he's going in to conquer. But right now he says, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the one who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer. Othniel, the son of Caleb's younger brother, Kenaz, so his nephew, was the one who conquered it. So Achsah became Othniel's wife. So yes, we have cousins marrying cousins here. Which again, we can't judge ancient practices by modern day mentality. But what we see here is Othniel, the first hero of judges, or the first judge, is he's got a bit of a family history. He is the son-in-law, the nephew, both in this circular family tree. He's the son-in-law of Caleb, one of the original heroes. And so when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Othniel, the son of Caleb's younger brother Kenaz. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him. Again, nothing about Othniel suggests that he was heroic. Nothing about Othniel suggests that he was amazing. And other than that, he was willing to let the Spirit of the Lord fill him. He's not a bad guy, but it doesn't say he's particularly strong. It doesn't say he's particularly brilliant. He's got somebody with a bit of history, and he's willing to let God use him. So the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he became Israel's judge, rescuer. He went to war against King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram, and the Lord gave Othniel victory over him. So there was peace in the land for 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. And you wish it said, and they lived happily ever after. But that's not what happens because of the cycle of apostasy, right? They have peace in the land while Othniel's alive. He dies, and next week we'll find out what happens after that, but it's not good. The name Othniel, see that L in there, so Beth-El is house of God. Othniel means God is my strength. So he was willing to let God use him and be his strength. And really that's all any of us can do. So our takeaway for this week is simply that we need to listen to God and obey him. We don't come to the Bible, his manufacturer's opinion, as our last choice. We make it our first choice. We ask ourselves, what does God want me to do? And then we do it. We read his word, and that tells us what he wants us to do. John 10:10, Jesus said, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I came to give people life and life to the full. We will never experience everything that God has for us. We will never experience everything God has for us if we don't follow the path that he's laid out for us. I'm going to ask our prayer team to come up and lead us in prayer, and please ask God to help us follow him and follow the path that he's laid out for us.